welcome to our KPMG webinar on a new migration system for Australia's future. Joining me today is Samantha Penchal from our migration area. My name is Mark Wright. I lead the immigration practice at KPMG across the Asia Pacific and in Australia. Samantha?
Hi everybody, my name is Samantha Penchal. I'm a senior manager in the KPMG migration practice. I've been working in the area of corporate immigration for the past 15 years.
So today we're going to take you through the context that drove the review of the migration program, some details that were released on Thursday, the 27th of April by the Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill, and our view on what the next steps are going to be as the changes foreshadowed in the migration review document are legislated and how it's likely to impact your business. But first of all, the context for change. So the government, in conjunction with the migration review document, did release a brief signpost document which effectively flagged their intention around some of the migration reform measures that were contained in the review document without going into concrete details about what those changes were likely to be. Now, the most important thing I want to highlight here is that the release of the migration review document is actually the start of a process, and this has been foreshadowed by the government themselves in their tandem release of the signpost document on Thursday the 27th. So if many of you were expecting concrete changes to be released in conjunction with the migration review document, that's not the case. And Samantha and I, during this presentation, will give you an idea of what to expect in the coming weeks and months as the government's plans for changes become a little clearer. What led to the migration review following the election of the Labor government in 2022 is an intention to align Australia's migration program with a fundamentally disrupted workforce and workplace. And in so doing, the government have flagged what it refers to as root and branch reform of the migration program. But there are a couple of drivers that are important in informing the government's strategic direction in establishing a new migration program. And first of all, the government is very keen to align the migration program in its reform state with Australia's values. And most importantly, the government's view is that it does not support a situation where temporary residents are permanently temporary. The government statistics indicate that there's approximately 173,000 temporary visa holders in Australia that have been a temporary resident for 5 years or longer. And the government philosophically is not supportive of that permanently temporary arrangement and wants to move to a situation where that temporary number of visas is reduced overall. Australia's unemployment rate is currently at 3.5%. It's been at 3.5% for most of the last 12 months, and that's at 60-year low levels. KPMG economists predict that our unemployment rate in Australia, irrespective of global economic circumstances, is not likely to get much higher than 3.7%. And in employment terms, that's effectively full employment. So the government anticipates that the skill shortages and the labour market challenges that many businesses have faced over the past 12 months or so will continue for the foreseeable future. So migration will continue to play an important part in attracting and retaining talent to Australia. In the 2 years that Australia was in lockdown, Australia competitively lost a lot to our trading partners, most particularly trading partners such as Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And following the reopening of international borders, much of the talent that pre-pandemic might have considered Australia as an attractive destination have really been attracted to moving their talent and their family to those locations that have fundamentally reformed their migration program during lockdown. So in effect, Australia's playing catch up in building a migration program that is fit for purpose in a post-pandemic world that will re-establish Australia as a competitive global talent hub. Then finally, and something that's received quite a bit of media recently, is the high net overseas migration rate predicted to be over the next 2 years, which is predicted to be around 650,000. But for many of us, that's not surprising, given that net overseas migration during the 2-year period of lockdown was actually in the negative. So Australia again is playing catch up in attracting the talent that we lost in many respects in net overseas migration levels during the 2-year lockdown. It's also important to highlight that much of that 650,000 number is made up of the sharp increase in overseas student visa numbers. So in releasing the review, the government have identified 4 foundation policy shifts that will inform the details of the changes that we're going to see in the coming weeks and months. The first one is that the government wants to prioritise people that need to enhance the economic prosperity and security of Australia. So that's about ensuring that a migration program targets the right skills and the right talent in the appropriate numbers for the Australian economy in a much more targeted way, and deploys that talent to employers, industry sectors and locations that most need that. So effectively, we're moving from what the Home Affairs Minister refers to as a spaghetti of the migration program to one that's now going to be very targeted. Secondly, the government wants to ensure that a revitalised migration program is a lot simpler than it has been over the past 2 to 3 decades. One of the common reasons why overseas talent cite Australia as a location that it chooses not to relocate to is just the sheer complexity of our immigration program. And in this day and age, if an immigration outcome is too cumbersome, too long, or too complex, talent have an abundance of choices elsewhere that they'll choose to relocate to. So simplification is a very important foundation priority as part of this change. Thirdly, delivering outcomes for Australians and migrants post-arrival. So the government have identified a very important era of cooperation with state and territory governments. And the government has realised that successful migration goes beyond the visa outcome. It actually goes to the successful settlement of the talent in their chosen location, so the appropriate social and infrastructure support to support talent and their family in whatever location that they choose to work, but also working cooperatively with the state government, state and territory governments. And that's the first time that such a change has been instituted by the Australian government. We'll be going into a bit more details of that during this webinar. And finally, restore the Australian values of integrity, fairness and inclusion at the heart of each stage of the system. So Australia has a very sophisticated migration system that focuses very much on post-entry compliance. So the Australian government is going to leverage from a lot of the data that it collects as a result of the visa application, and is going to be working very closely with areas of government that support foreign nationals and, in fact, local nationals working in Australia, areas such as the Fair Work Ombudsman, the Australian Taxation Office, to ensure that there's a whole of government approach to supporting the successful migration of talent to Australia. So Samantha and I thought it was important to lay out at this start of the process of reform and change what the timeline for migration reform might be. So 27th of April was the release of the review of the migration system, and the government has outlined its migration strategy, which I've just shared with you. In May, the federal government will release its budget on the 9th of May. And my understanding is that there will be no further measures other than dollar allocations and clarification of migration numbers that are in the federal budget. So many of the changes that would otherwise have been contemplated in the budget are in the migration review document released on the 27th of April. Running in tandem with the migration review is a joint standing committee on migration. And the Joint Standing Committee on Migration has been running a number of hearings nationally for the past several months. And in fact, KPMG is excited to be invited to appear before the Migration Standing Committee on the 16th of May. I would anticipate that the Joint Standing Committee on Migration will work very closely with the Migration Review and the wider government review on changes to the migration program. So we'll effectively have two processes working in tandem. During May and June, importantly, the Australian government has flagged that the Joint Standing Committee on Migration and also the Migration Reform Task Force will be conducting a series of consultations at government, stakeholder and union level, which will inform the details of a lot of the changes and reform measures that have been flagged in the review document. So we can expect by the end of June that we'll be a lot clearer on the level of detail and the nature of the changes that the government plans to make. And in fact, it would be expected, I think, that many of the changes will progressively start to be introduced over the coming months, flowing from that review. June to September, the Immigration Minister will be releasing further changes. I would anticipate aimed at the simplification of the existing migration program. Anything that requires executive level change, such as, for example, changes to labour market testing or changes to occupational grouping of temporary visas, they require executive level change rather than legislative change. So those changes are much easier and quicker to put in effect. So I would anticipate that many of the changes that the Immigration Minister will be making between June and September are likely to be streamlining measures to simplify the visa preparation, lodgement and approval process. Anything that requires a legislative change in the current setup of the Australian Parliament, I think it's reasonable to expect will take a little longer to pass through both houses. Then finally, in calendar year 2023, the government have indicated that it is going to release the final migration strategy, which will encompass many of the changes that will progressively be introduced between now and the end of the calendar year, but also firm up many of the reform measures that have been foreshadowed in the current review, some of which we're going to be touching on today. And then finally, and most importantly, the government has also flagged reform of the family migration program that will be considered separately, but given the pivotal impact that family migration has on attracting and retaining talent to Australia, KPMG believe that's a very important measure to ensure that Australia reestablishes itself as an attractive talent hub. So with that, I'll pass over to Samantha.
Thanks, Mark. Now, we appreciate that a lot of those who are watching this webinar will be really interested to hear about the changes that are likely to impact the sponsored visa program, so particularly the subclass 482, the temporary skill shortage TSS visa. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of details yet to be known, but of course, we want to take the time today to really talk you through what we do know and what we're expecting on the basis of the review document that was released last Thursday. So starting with employer sponsorship. So as Mark mentioned, the Home Affairs Minister did talk about the vast number of visa categories as a giant bowl of spaghetti. And I think that everybody that works or touches the migration industry can relate to that. There are just hundreds and hundreds of visa subclasses that are available at the moment. And it's clear that the government are very keen to significantly reduce the number. But at this point, it's unclear whether we'd be looking at a situation like we've had previously, a move from the 457 to the 482. So it's unclear at this stage whether the 482 would be replaced by a different visa subclass or whether the 482 would remain but be significantly changed. One of the big ticket items was around TSMIT, so the temporary skilled migration income threshold, and the quite large, very significant adjustment. So essentially the review did announce or the Home Affairs Minister rather announced an increase to the temporary skilled migration income threshold for the first time in 13 years, from $53,900 right up to $70,000 with effect from the 1st of July this year. The Home Affairs Minister did mention as well that that will be regularly indexed rather than, staying where it was for another 13 years. With it being indexed, we would expect each year, probably on the 1st of July, and with scope for age adjustments as well. So when we talk about age adjustments, what we would expect to see is that perhaps there would be a higher TISMET level for those individuals who are older to ensure that older visa applicants aren't underpaid for the skills and experience that they have. In terms of what we're looking at around TISMET, given that this is quite a significant increase, is we are, of course, working with our clients and looking through reports of data to check which applicants, so whether that's current visa holders or potential visa holders in the future for our clients, would be affected by this quite significant increase. But if this is something that concerns you or your employees, do feel free to reach out. In terms of labour market analysis, the review did talk about an expanded role for the Jobs and Skills Australia body, which is a newly created body to advise the government on skills and occupation. Essentially, what this is looking at is a complete rework of the ways that skills and occupations are looked at in terms of your temporary skilled migration program. So at the moment, a lot of you would be familiar with the various skilled occupation lists that we have. There's quite a number of occupation lists, and it can be quite a juggle of finding an appropriate ANSCO occupation for the role that you're looking to nominate, and then fitting that to a different skilled occupation list. So essentially what we're seeing here is a desire to move away from that and to move away from ANSCO, to move away from skilled occupation lists as well. Did want to make mention at this point that this is quite an aspirational goal, in our opinion, given that the review also makes mention of the fact that Jobs and Skills Australia does not currently have the resources to perform this type of role. So we would expect that this would be a longer term goal that the government has, or that the review is recommending, rather than something that would be implemented quite quickly. But it certainly would be quite a significant shift, and is something that will keep, of course, everybody updated on as more information becomes available. In terms of visa portability, so at the moment, some of you would be familiar with the fact that a 482 visa holder has 60 calendar days from the date that they cease employment with their current employer to find a new employer to sponsor their 482 visa, or to apply for a different visa or depart the country. So the review makes mention of the fact that that 60 calendar days is very, very short. It's a very short period of time for somebody to, leave one employer, find a new employer, go through the interview process. Obviously a lot of pressure as well on themselves, perhaps, family members as well, to make that change within such a short time frame. The review makes mention of the fact that it usually takes most people at least 3 months to find a new employer. So they see that 60 days as also having the potential to lead to exploitation of workers who potentially are being exploited by their sponsor, and then are feeling sort of very stuck with their sponsor for reasons of only having that 60 calendar days to find a new employer. So essentially what the review calls for is, given that it usually takes people 3 months, they're actually recommending up to 6 months, or allowing 6 months for visa holders to find a new sponsor. So that's something that is not, it hasn't been announced yet by the Home Affairs Minister. It's simply a recommendation in the review at this point. But it would, of course, potentially lead to a little bit more visa portability, and 482 visa holders feeling that they do have a little bit more support to find a new employer if they were to cease employment with their sponsor. So that's another one that we'll be watching to see, what comes out following the review. Now, when we're looking at the 482 visa in a little bit more detail, I think it's really important to look at the 3 cohorts that the review calls for. So essentially, as I mentioned, it's unclear whether these cohorts would fit under a 482 visa or a renewed version of the 482 visa. But there's certainly mention in the review of these 3 separate cohorts. So if I can talk about the first one, the high salary cohort. Essentially, what the review calls for is for this to be based for specialised workers, which would not be limited to a government-approved list. So there wouldn't be a skilled occupation list that would apply. Is expected to be primarily intercompany transfers, obviously quite highly specialised employees as well, given the high salary threshold. And that threshold as well is expected to be around the $95,000 mark. Although we have seen reference to a slightly lower amount as well, so sort of low 90,000s. And the benefits of this particular high salary cohort. So what are the benefits of being able to access this cohort? We would expect to see faster processing times, minimal documents required for lodgement, and also no labour market testing requirements either. So this will be really quite a streamlined, simplified pathway for those individuals who are able to access that high salary. In terms of the mid-level cohort, so this is one where we see more similarities perhaps between the current 482 visa program and the new cohorts that have been mentioned in the review. So this one would be based on skills which are needed and are paid a salary at or above the revised TISMET, which is that $70,000 I mentioned earlier. And again, with the potential for age-adjusted income thresholds, again, for your older visa applicants. Essentially, this would be one where there would be some additional requirements. So, how does it compare to the high salary cohort? For example, you'd expect a bit more documentation to be required. You'd expect slightly longer processing times. And then you would also expect some occupational grouping to be applied to it. So rather than being quite open, perhaps some occupational grouping that may be tied to the work that the Jobs and Skills Australia body are doing in terms of identifying occupation groups that require access to this particular cohort. And then the lower paid cohorts. This is particularly interesting and one that we're really keen to receive some more information from the government on. Essentially, this lower paid cohort would be to assist sectors experiencing persistent skill shortages. So ones that have been mentioned so far around care workers, which would attract potentially a lower minimum salary threshold. And we would expect these individuals to attract a greater processing and compliance scrutiny. So potentially longer processing times in some cases, although of course in the care sector, appreciate the government are trying to fasten the processing of those high demand occupations. That would be interesting to see how that plays out. But compliance scrutiny, not only prior to the visa being granted, but we'd also expect a higher level of compliance scrutiny post-visa grant as well to ensure that these workers aren't being exploited. It would essentially be one that potentially would change with time, depending on the need for different skills in different sectors. But what we are certainly hoping for is to see that this could also help semi-skilled roles, particularly in rural or remote Australia. And at the moment, a lot of those individuals filling those roles need to rely on labour agreements to access visas that they may not otherwise be eligible for. That can be a very costly and time-consuming process to obtain a labour agreement. So we would hope that this lower paid cohort, this particular stream, would assist individuals and businesses in those types of sectors.
And Samantha and I were in reviewing the document released by the government on Thursday, the 27th, felt that the high salary cohort might be able to be applied in a way that supports business travellers, for example. The information that KPMG had available to us prior to the release of the document indicated that the government was very interested in introducing some reform measures to business migration, because there is a lot of ambiguity around business travel as opposed to work-related activity, and the current arrangements are really not fit for purpose. So the high salary cohort, given the streamlined nature, given that it's particularly suited to intra-company transfers, given that it is minimal documentation and clearly has a salary threshold, lends itself to being deployed in a very flexible way to support targeted project-related business travel. So, for example, if you're a business that has international talent that needs to be deployed for a period, a very targeted period, for example, of say 12 months for a particular project. This particular change allows you to mobilise that talent very quickly with a minimal level of processing downtime. So that's one area that we're keeping a very close eye on.
Thanks, Mark. The next item, which is a really a bigger announcement that the Home Affairs Minister actually made during her speech last Thursday, was around permanent residents. And she made a very broad, sweeping statement about the changes to permanent residents. So essentially, she made a statement saying that all temporary visa holders in Australia right now would have a pathway to permanent residence by the end of 2023. And this really does align with what Mark mentioned earlier around the government not, really wanting to shift away from this state where we have so many people permanently temporary in Australia. And this announcement certainly aligns with that, but I did want to flag at this stage that we don't have any details of exactly what this will look like, what that pathway might be. So if you're receiving questions from your employees, from people within your business, just to flag that we don't have any additional details at this stage, and we'll be watching this very, very closely. Conscious that a similar statement was made previously after the COVID-19 lockdowns around opening up a pathway for individuals who would otherwise not have a pathway to PR and were effectively sort of stuck inside Australia during the COVID-19 lockdowns. Essentially, that change was around if you've spent a certain period of time inside Australia during the COVID lockdowns, you would have a pathway to PR, even if your occupation falls on the short-term skilled occupation list. It's unclear at this point if that potentially that opening will be opened up further to everybody who's here by the end of this year, having that pathway, but there's certainly nothing for individuals that they need to do right now. So there's not a different visa that you need to apply for to access this or anything that you could sort of be doing right now. It's just something that we're going to wait and watch and provide updates on as soon as they come through.
So as I mentioned earlier during the introduction, there's going to be a period of a very intensive 2-month period of consultation. And the government, as part of its review, flagged a number of areas that will form the basis of that targeted consultation. So Samantha and I just want to take a few minutes to walk you through those areas and our view on what that might look like during that consultation period.
Thanks, Mark. And the first one here really comes back to that idea of that visa portability. So that has been in the news a little bit, talking about what might happen if individuals are given up to 6 months to secure new employment. Just really wanting to flag at this point that that's just a recommendation that was part of the review for that 6-month period to be given to 482 visa holders. We don't know if the government will actually end up implementing that. And if they do, obviously the timing around that is uncertain as well. The review, as I mentioned, did suggest up to 6 months, but we might see something shorter than that. So that's really just talking about that. And I think that feeds nicely into the next item here, Mark, as well, because interestingly, the review did make mention of this visa portability perhaps not being really loved by some employers, and the review did make mention of the fact that there may be some hesitation when we're talking about visa portability. But the way that they sort of countered that in the review, which is quite interesting, was immediately by talking about the Skilling Australia Fund levy. And essentially, the Skilling Australia Fund levy is quite a heavy cost. It's quite expensive at the moment up front to pay the Skilling Australia Fund levy when you're sponsoring a 482 visa holder. And there have been quite a number of complaints about the cost and where those costs are going. So what the review actually makes mention of is the fact that they are they're recommending that we shift away from this upfront payment to a monthly payment of the Skilling Australia Fund levy. So essentially you'd be paying for each month that you have that visa holder within your business. But if that visa holder was to go to a new sponsor, that new sponsor would then pick up those costs on a monthly basis. So again, unfortunately, we don't have too many more details around exactly what this would look like. From my perspective, I don't know about you, Mark, but my immediate thought was, how is this going to work on a practical level? How are these monthly payments going to be made? So that's still yet to be seen. And of course, we'll circulate that information once it's known, if that recommendation is picked up.
Yeah. An interesting area that was touched on in the review document was reviewing and redesigning the Business Innovation Investment Program and the Global Talent Visa, together with the Skilled Independent Visa Program. Now, for me and for Samantha and I, that was very interesting because all the indicators and a lot of the media released by the government in the lead up to the release of the review indicated that the Business Innovation Investment Program, potentially the Global Talent Visa, might not exist in a reformed migration program. But interestingly, the government has reaffirmed its commitment to both of those programs, but in a fundamentally different way, and repurposing those programs so that they're much more targeted around the skills and attributes that a future workforce in Australia requires. And the government has flagged two areas in particular. So innovation, that would capture areas such as cybersecurity and the like. There is an enormous shortage of talent in Australia around innovation industries and certain high-level technology expertise. And a Business Innovation Investment Program and a Global Talent Visa can be repurposed very much to target that. But also the government is keen to ensure that those programs are deployed to access talent that's not already in Australia. One of the criticisms of the Global Talent Visa is that there was a high percentage of successful applicants in for that visa in the past that would have already had a alternate pathway to Australia via another visa avenue, or were already in Australia. Which in some respects defeats the purpose of those programs. So the review period, the consultation period, will include a repurposing of those two programs. And given its importance to building a future-ready industries in Australia and workforce, KPMG will be keeping a very close eye on that. The Skilled Independent Visa Program is not often talked about in employer circles, but it's an incredibly successful, by world standards, program that Australia's had in place for many years. But the Australian government has lost some competitiveness in that program to similar programs that have been deployed in locations such as Canada, for example, that have, in building out a skilled independent program, have placed a far greater emphasis on a younger age demographic to ensure that the return on talent investment is as long as possible, and the productive contribution that talent makes to the local economy, but also what I call the employability factor. So it's one thing to have skills and attributes and qualifications, which often a skilled independent visa will recognise and reward, but that doesn't necessarily translate to employability as far as the Australian labour market is concerned. So the reform of the Skilled Independent Visa Program will pick up those two areas, a more attractive attribution for younger demographic under that program, and a greater emphasis on employability of skills that are applied to the Australian labour market.
In terms of labour market testing, so this was another interesting one that came out of the review. A lot of people watching this webinar will be familiar with the current labour market testing requirements around placing 3 ads, one of those ads being on the government's website as well. So the review made mention of the fact that the labour market testing as it stands is really not fit for purpose, particularly in full employment, as Mark mentioned earlier. Businesses are trying very, very hard to fill roles within the Australian labour market, and for various reasons, particularly the complexity of the current migration program, businesses are adverse to going straight to the visa program if they can avoid it. And essentially, the review calls for a complete relook at the way that labour market testing is done. So it's looking at moving away from employer-led labour market testing, where the sponsor's required to show they've done labour market testing, a really data-driven approach to labour market testing instead. So this comes back to that new role of the Jobs and Skills Australia body that I mentioned earlier, and also the forming of a Migration Advisory Council, which is looked to be modelled off the UK version, which is seen to be quite a gold standard in terms of being a body that advises the Immigration Department around where the labour market, where labour market testing shows that roles are required and that there are skill shortages and that they could be filled by temporary visa holders in the country. So it's a really big, significant change. But again, potentially one that's a bit idealistic, I would say at this point, aspirational, I think is the word that's coming up a little bit throughout the review, just given again that, Jobs and Skills Australia has not been set up to perform this role yet. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. But I think overall a really positive change to move away from that employer-led labour market testing that, a lot of employers have difficulty with and feel is a little bit pointless in the current environment.
One of the more alarming elements that arose during the review of the migration program was a statistic that only 16% of foreign students actually transitioned to permanent residence, which is a generational loss of talent being lost to overseas markets, where Australia invests enormously in the education sector of foreign students, only to lose that talent once that talent graduates. So the government have flagged an intention to review the student visa program, but in a very targeted way. And this will relate to a phenomenon I mentioned earlier, which is overlaying a greater level of employability to graduates from Australian universities. So, for example, simply because a foreign student graduates with a degree or master's qualification from an Australian university doesn't necessarily translate them to them being employable within the Australian labour market. So the expanded role that Samantha and I have been talking about around Jobs and Skills Australia will extend into the review of the student visa program, where the employability element of certain qualifications and certain attributes that clearly are in demand in Australia by employers in certain industry sectors will translate to the ability for a student visa who graduates in Australia to then have a pathway to remain on a long-term basis and ultimately a pathway to permanent residence. So it's going to become a much more targeted post-graduation graduate student visa program, I suspect. This is a very, very important talent cohort for many employers in Australia, not just the student visa cohort, where the Australian government has been reviewing the student visa working cap, but also the extent to which those graduating students choose to remain in Australia and how they transition to a productive workforce. So this is an area that KPMG will be very actively involved in ensuring that the revision of the student program is aligned with the philosophical direction of a reformed migration program.
And the final one we have here is around migrant support. So the review calls for further investment in social enterprises that focus on the drivers of migrant economic integration, including those who face particular barriers in the labour market, so particularly migrant women and humanitarian entrants as well. This was quite an interesting one. So they talk about the current programs that they have in place for people after their visa has been granted. They don't go a long way to explaining exactly how, where they're going to invest that further money, but they do talk about the fact that the programs are quite small at the moment. So that really seeing that as a positive to really expand those out. Particularly when we're looking at the permanent migration cap as an example, so that's currently been increased up to 195,000 places. A large proportion of that is made up of secondary visa applicants, so the partner of the primary applicant and children as well. And studies have shown, and this is drawn out in the review, that particularly migrant women are less likely to be in the workforce compared to women, Australian women or permanent residents. And that is quite a big difference there. And so the review does talk about the benefits of those migrant women, having a role in the workforce, joining the workforce, not only on themselves and the economy, but also on their children, particularly daughters. So I found that quite interesting, and I think it's definitely a positive that
it's a really important change to make. Yeah, very positive that was included in the review. Something that I get a little too excited about is the government's directional change around taking a whole of government approach to migration reform. And the reason that this is really exciting is that this has never been done in the history of Australia's migration program to the extent that the government is foreshadowing. And what the government's effectively looking to do is, in unison with Jobs and Skills Australia and the tripartite approach that Samantha mentioned earlier, picking up on the Migration Advisory Council, work very closely with state and territory governments around not only the size of the migration program, but its composition. So I think what we'll find is a migration program and the attraction of skills and talent that is as closely aligned to the particular needs of locations across the length and breadth of Australia as possible. And that is a fabulously positive direction as far as migration reform is concerned. And I know this is an area that state governments have been wanting to be more involved in for many, many years. And I think the Australian government have, in this change, foreshadowed quite a sea change in the way in which migration looks and is delivered in the next decade and beyond. So this is an area that I'm not only very excited about, but I think will make a real difference to many employers who are particularly those employers that might be located outside of the primary capitals of Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, where about 85% of skilled foreign talent still chooses to live and work. So we'll be actively involved in working with the government around what that change looks like. So in closing, there's a couple of areas that we would encourage you to just keep an eye on, continue to work with your advisor, continue to monitor in terms of the impact on your workforce. First of all, as I mentioned, in May and June, that consultation period will be where the metaphorical rubber really hits the road. It's where we'll start to see a lot of the substantial detail that was not in the migration review signpost document. And I would expect that we're going to be a lot clearer on some of the simplification measures that the government is so keen to implement as quickly as possible to minimise those roadblocks to talent choosing to live and work in Australia. Those streamlining measures will continue throughout June through to, I anticipate, September. And one of the areas that will be a little challenging for employers is that I suspect that the government will be progressively releasing changes that will simplify and improve the migration experience, if I can put it that way, for both the employer and the visa applicant. Now, many of those changes will be executive in nature, as I mentioned earlier, won't require legislative change. So it would not be unusual for those changes to be progressively introduced. But I think that should be seen very much in a positive light, because I think it's going to make life a lot easier for visa applicants than might otherwise have been the case. The final review that will be released, we anticipate around October. And some of those changes that are in that final review will require legislative change. And if legislative change is required, the government typically identify legislative change to take effect on two key dates, 1 January or 1 July. And it is possible, certainly the law allows changes in migration to be retrospective. In other words, an individual who already holds a visa that's subject to a retrospective change might be impacted by the change that's introduced. But more often than not, governments apply changes at a certain date for applications that are lodged after that date or lodged and not yet decided as at the date of the change. But that's an area that KPMG will closely monitor and keep you advised on in terms of managing the impact on your workforce. And that's the last area. The most important thing is that to remember is, and it's not unusual, that changes of this size and scale generate a lot of anxiety, a lot of questions, and regrettably at this point, many of the questions cannot be answered. There's just not enough detail, and we're not in the business of speculating what the government might be thinking about doing. One of the things that we'll be working on very closely with government is giving employers as much notice as possible about changes so that the workforce management impact can be managed effectively with both the existing and future workforce for employers. We're going to be entering a period for the remainder of the calendar year 2023 where that constant overlay of changes against your existing and future workforce plans will just need to be managed on an ongoing basis. So with that, I wanted to, first of all, thank Samantha for her contribution and thank all of you for attending the webinar today. Thank you, and we look forward to supporting you in the future.